everybody. Good morning or good evening. My name is Raleigh Green, and I'm a board member of the Hurley Heritage Society and the organizer of our lecture series. Welcome to tonight's lecture. It's presented by the Hurley Heritage Society. The lecture title is the 1688 Glorious Revolution in Ulster County and the Scandal of the Misogynist Dutch Reformed Minister of Kingston. Before we get started, a couple quick notes. Please be sure you are on mute to ensure that everyone can hear the guest speaker and that there are no interruptions. During the presentation, if you have a question, you can use the chat feature to send your questions, and they will be answered during the presentation or at the end. At the conclusion of the formal presentation, we'll open things up to further discussions. Be sure to unmute yourself at that time. The presentation is being recorded, and we will be posting it to the Hurley Heritage Society website with links on our Facebook page in the coming days. So, without further ado, let me introduce you to our guest speaker, Dr. Evan Haefele, a professor at Texas A&M University. Dr. Haefele is joining us this evening from Tokyo, Japan, where he's a Fulbright lecturer teaching American history, an historian of colonial North America and Atlantic world at Texas A&M. Evan Haefele specializes in the political, religious, indigenous, and imperial history of the colonial Northeast. Born and raised on Eastern Long Island, New York, he previously taught at Princeton, where he received his PhD, as well as Tufts, Columbia, and the London School of Economics. He has held a variety of fellowships, most recently at the National Endowment of the Humanities. His published books relating to colonial American and early New York history include New Netherland and the Dutch Origins of American Religious Liberty, A Claim of Accidental Pluralism, America and the Religious Politics of English Expansion, and with Kevin Sweeney, Captors and Captives, the 1704 French and Indian Raid on Deerfield. This talk is part of a long-standing research project of his in New York and the Glorious Revolution of 1688 to 1689, a decisive and divisive turning point in early New York history. Welcome, Professor Haefele.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction, and greetings and good morning from Tokyo, where it's now 9 o'clock in the morning. I was really glad we could do this, and this is one of the magical things about Zoom, is that we can have these connections over extraordinary distances. But I'm really happy to share this work with you. I came across this story. Sorry, let me just, whoops. Almost about 30 years ago, when I was a graduate student doing research in the New York Historical Society for my dissertation. And a lot of this information did not make it into the dissertation. As you'll see, it's kind of a crazy story, but it's sort of hard to tie it into some bigger argument the way one has to do in a dissertation. But I did publish an article, two articles about this. One about what was happening in Ulster County in much greater detail, and then another biography of the key character, the bad Dominie. Dominie, for those of you who don't know, is the term the Dutch used for the Dutch Reformed minister in the Dutch Reformed Church. And he is the star of our show today, a man named Laurentius van den Bosch. So I wrote a brief biography of him based on everything I could find out about him. And so this talk is kind of pulling together information from both of those pieces, which I will share the information about those at the end of the talk, so you can read those if you want more information. the first thing I want to emphasize about this is that the whole reason I'm able to do this is because this man, Laurentius van den Bosch, who was minister for a few years in Kingston and Ulster County. And it's important to remember that at this time, there was only one church in all of Ulster County, apart from the Huguenot church down in Newport. So if we're not a French-speaking Huguenot, the only place you could go to church was in Kingston, and it was this one church presided over by this one very peculiar individual who we'll learn a lot more about in the course of this talk. And because of his bad behavior, there was an investigation which created a bunch of sources that are housed, a whole file of sources that are housed in a folder at the New York Historical Society. And I've long wanted to do more with this because it's a very rich collection of sources where people were investigating his behavior in the community. And a lot of that behavior involved him hanging around with women and not always treating them very well. But as a result, we get a lot of testimony from women and we get a lot of glimpses of what women's daily life was like in this community. And that is something that's really, really rare for all of early New York history, but especially for Ulster County. We don't always, and that's one of the things I want to emphasize here, is that you don't always have all the information you want. Your historians are very dependent on sources. So this incident created a bunch of sources that opened up a window onto the early history of Ulster County, where otherwise we only have little bits and pieces of information. So for that reason alone, I think it's an interesting story, worth exploring. But also, it's so nice to be able to present to this Hurley Historical Society group, because you people are from there and this is your history. This is not well known. It's pretty like like the title says, it was a scandal, so people didn't talk about it after it happened and tried to forget about it. But it was recorded, so we can find out what was going on in Ulster County in the late 17th century. And what's useful about this particular story is that it doesn't just shine a light on local life in Ulster County, but it also shows how local events were connected to big international events like the Glorious Revolution, which some of you may have heard about, others may not have heard about, but you will learn what the Glorious Revolution was and why that mattered to the history of early America in the course of this talk. So now, just to set the scene very briefly, as I'm sure all of you know, the key fact is that what's now New York began as the Dutch colony of New Netherland. And in 1664, it was conquered by the English. And so Ulster County is not a Dutch name, Kingston's not a Dutch name, Hurley's not a Dutch name. Those were all English names that get imposed on the region after the English take over. The Dutch had started settling what's now Ulster County in the 1650s. So there was a Dutch community there. They called Kingston Esopus, which is the indigenous name for the region. But then the English came in and took over. And if you want to learn more about that whole process, there is a book coming out very soon this year. I think it is going to be available any day now, by Russell Shorto, the journalist who wrote The Island at the Center of the World, which was a really best-selling book about 20 years ago. Some of you may remember that. So his book, Taking Manhattan, The Extraordinary Events That Created New York and Shaped America, will be coming out soon to a bookstore near you. And I have not read it. I don't know exactly what's in it, but it's a great story. And I think will be really fascinating reading for those of you who want to get a little more background on this process. So now to get back to Ulster County. This is a map that I did for the article that I published about this story, and just, you're from there, so you know the geography, but there's a few points I want to highlight here. First of all, Ulster is in New York, but through into the 17th and 18th century, its main reference point was actually Albany. It was Dutch colonists from Albany who first settled the region, and a lot of the economic and personal ties were up the river to Albany rather than down the river to New York. So it's well, I'm from Long Island, so this is all upstate for me. So it's a very upstate sort of story. Another thing is you can kind of see how comparatively isolated Ulster County is from the main population centers up in Albany and Schenectady, and then down around New York. At this time, there's basically hardly anybody living in Dutchess County, only a few people in Orange County, and just a few communities, maybe about 1,500 people or so total living in Ulster County. So this is a small place, and it's a pretty poor place. And it had gotten off to a rough start with a couple of wars with the indigenous Esopus in the time of New Netherland. So Ulster was a bit of a backwater. It had a hard time. It had a church, but it had a hard time recruiting a minister. Um, and then it became increasingly mixed over the course of the 17th century, starting with Dutch colonists, and then some English come in, and then French Huguenots and Walloons, who we'll learn about more in a second. But it's the Dutch culture and the Dutch language and the Dutch church that is the dominant element here. And my favorite fact is that New Paltz, which as many of you know, began as a French-speaking community. After a few generations, they stopped speaking French, but in the 18th century, they started speaking Dutch before they learned English. So it's very Dutch-oriented, and pretty much all of the story that we're going to be talking about today was happening in the Dutch language. And here you see a bit more of a zoom in. Again, you are all very familiar with this, I'm sure. But Kingston was the original settlement. There was an attempt to create sort of a aristocratic manor at a place called Fox Hall, which was entrusted with a prominent Englishman, but he didn't have enough money to turn it into that. So you just had the town of Kingston as the dominant settlement, and then Hurley was the next major settlement. And then in around the 1680s, you started seeing these other little communities pop up where people are moving out, but they're still very small, tiny hamlets mostly. And Saugerties was, there was a sawmill there, but not a whole lot else. So the main places involved here are Kingston and Hurley, but there's a few other people out moving further out into the countryside at the time that this whole story happens. Now we get to our main character, Laurentius van den Bos. So he's a Dominie, meaning a minister in the Dutch Reformed Church. And the first evidence I found of him is from 1679, when he was in Leiden in the Netherlands, and he was getting some financial help from the Walloon Synod, running the Walloon church. And I have no idea how old he was at the time, but I'm just sort of guessing that he was probably in his 20s, his early 20s at the time that this happened. I don't know exactly where he was born, but he was a Walloon. And for those of you who don't know, Walloons are the French-speaking people from what's now Belgium, the southern Netherlands. So there's a big language border across Belgium. This is a map of modern Belgium. And the southern part was French-speaking. And a number of people, before there were Huguenots, in the time of New Netherlands, And even many of the early founders of New Paltz were actually Walloons and not Huguenots. Huguenots are Protestants from France, from the country of France. There were a number of French-speaking Protestants from what is now Belgium, and they were Walloon Protestants. So, and these people are the ones who are really important for our story. So, Laurentius van den Bosch was either, I'm not sure if he was born there or if he was born to a family of refugees who had fled to the Netherlands from what was then the Spanish Netherlands. Many of you probably know the Dutch Republic gained its independence in a long 80 years war for independence from Spain. But they only got the northern part of the territory. The southern part remained loyal to the Spanish. And it's from the southern part that Laurentius van den Bosch's family came. And it's also from this southern part that the people who established New Paltz came. They came from a region right around here, which was in the 17th century taken over by France. They had fled as refugees to the Palatinate, which is here south of Cologne in the Holy Roman Empire, and then eventually made their way over to New York. And they named the town of New Paltz after their refuge in what's now Germany in the Palatinate. Now, the next thing we know about Van den Bosch is that he did try and become a minister in the Netherlands. He went to the Western Netherlands, to Gelderland, but after about 2 years was unable to find a position. And so he decides to go overseas and he moves to London. So I want to emphasize here that Laurentius van den Bosch, part of what's so interesting about him is French is his native language because he's a Walloon, but he's been living in the Dutch Republic, so he knows Dutch very well. And then he's learned enough English to become ordained as a minister in the Church of England by the Bishop of London. He doesn't know enough English to become a preacher. He's not super fluent, but he's enough to communicate, and he can write. There's a couple letters from him in English, so he can communicate in English, and decides to come over to America, more particularly to Carolina, which at this particular moment in time was a new colony. It needed people. And the promoters of Carolina were actively trying to recruit French-speaking Protestants, Walloons, Huguenots, whoever they could get to come to the colony. And there were pamphlets circulating around in Holland at the time. And I think he must have read one of those and thought that, aha, here is an opportunity for me. Now, because Van den Bosch was such a controversial figure, a lot of the histories of the early Huguenot community in early colonial America hardly mention him at all. But I do think, based on my research, that he is probably the first French-speaking Protestant minister in British America. Everybody says it's Pierre Darré, the man who founded the church in New Paltz, but it looks to me like Van den Bosch got to America a few weeks before, at least a few weeks before Pierre Darré did. But he went to Carolina first, which is where some of the first Huguenots were going. And as many of you probably know, another important piece of background information here is that at exactly this point in time, Louis XIV is ramping up his persecution of Protestants in France. And so thousands and thousands of Huguenots are leaving France. Many of them are going to England. Some of them are going to Holland. Others are going to what's now Germany. And then a few of the ones that were going to England made their way overseas to America. And one of the first places they went was actually to Carolina, which was actively recruiting French Protestants. And so here the map gives you sort of a sense. And what's really interesting about Van den Bosch's life, as you'll see, is that he kind of goes up and down the East Coast and makes connections with all of the different French Protestant communities there. Um, but they're often bad connections, as we will see. He is really not mentioned in most of the histories of Carolina or the Huguenots in Carolina, partly because he was not there for very long, but also because he did not get along well with the local Huguenots. He got there a little too soon. It was only after 1685 when Louis XIV completely banned Protestantism in France that you started getting the major migration of Huguenots to America, including Carolina. So the community is still pretty small. It's very new. It's still pretty poor. And they were not able to or not willing to pay Van den Bosch's salary. So he complained about that. And poverty might be part of the reason, but I think part of the reason might also be that Van den Bosch's religiosity was not as firmly, solidly Calvinist as many of the Huguenots would like. And we don't know, he was a Protestant minister in the church, but theologically, as you can see from the way he moved from being a Dutch Reformed minister to becoming an Anglican, he's a little more flexible than many other Calvinists. So he decides to leave Carolina. And he goes up north to Boston, Massachusetts, home of the Puritans, the people who had moved to New England to get away from the Anglican Church. So he's not a very welcome visitor to Boston, but there is a small and growing Huguenot community there because the Puritans' view of religion was very similar to that of the Huguenots and also that of the Dutch Reformed Church. And basically, Puritans are English Protestants who wish they could have had a church like the Dutch Reformed Church. But the Anglican Church refused to go all the way in that Protestant direction. And so rather than accept what the Puritans thought was a not perfectly biblical church, many of thousands of them went over to New England where they could set up a more purely Bible-based church, which was a congregational church. Very similar in theology and practice to that of the Dutch Reformed Church. Not exactly, but they recognized each other as allies. So Van den Bosch can relate to that, but obviously if he's coming in as an Anglican, which is the whole reason why the Puritans had left England, he's not going to be very welcome. And then, and the Anglican Church was not officially tolerated or permitted in Boston. So he tries to take up a position in the Huguenot Church, which would have been a Reformed church, but he also behaves as an Anglican in Boston, but an Anglican in secret. He does some preaching in people's homes. There's a few closet Anglicans there, or merchants who are visiting people from out of the colony who are regular English Anglicans spending some time in Boston. He performs a couple of marriages, religious services, which is illegal in Massachusetts at the time. And he gets in trouble with the authorities. We don't know exactly what happened, but they find out he's been doing some baptisms, he's been doing some marriages, he's been doing some preaching, all of this in secret in people's homes. And so the authorities speak to him, or they have some sort of try to clamp down on his activities. Don't know exactly what. We only have his letter where he complains that he'd been subject to all these sorts of outrages. And that letter is very revealing because it ties in, it's the first sign we see of a very key personality trait of this guy, which is his persecution complex. And it's also, I think, pretty clear that the guy was a total narcissist. We don't, they didn't have that sort of psychological terminology, but sometimes you go into the past and you can read people's letters and their personality really just jumps out at you. And that is very definitely the case with this guy, Laurentius van den Bosch. So he gets in trouble in Boston and has to leave Boston. And at this point, we can learn more about what he was like from the people who did not like him. And one of the key people who did not like him was the main minister in Boston, Cotton Mather, probably the most famous minister in 17th century America. And we have letters from him where he talks about Van den Bosch, saying Van den Bosch claimed he was being persecuted, but really all we did was talk to him and tell him to stop doing what he's doing. He was debauched. He would drink. He was profane, and um, he was in some ways a very bad Anglican, doing things like gambling and fornication and all these sorts of things were acceptable, and all of these are, of course, completely not acceptable in Puritan Boston at the time. Now, I think it's very likely that Van den Bosch was behaving in those ways, but I just want to emphasize that this is not just about him as a personality or as a morally flawed individual, but also about the religious and political conflicts. Because he is an Anglican, by discrediting him as a minister, by discrediting the work that he did, Cotton Mather is also discrediting the idea that there was a viable Anglican community in Boston at the time, which is exactly what Puritans wanted. They didn't want there to be a viable Anglican community there. The other person that really comes to dislike Van den Bosch is Pierre Daillet, the Huguenot minister, the first Huguenot minister in British America, the man who visited Ulster County and established the church in New Paltz and would spend time preaching there, moving back and forth from New York to Ulster in these years. And in the course of that, got to know Van den Bosch pretty well and also got to know people who knew him. And he was really worried that Van den Bosch's actions were going to discredit the Huguenots in the eyes of the Puritans, and basically writes a letter to the Cotton Mather and the other ministers in New England saying, please don't blame us French people for what this guy is doing. Later on, he complains that Van den Bosch acts perversely in everything. Exactly what he means by that, I'm not sure, but it's clear that Van den Bosch was antagonizing a lot of important people in colonial America in all kinds of communities. Now, that would not be of great historical significance, except that it happens at a very peculiar time in English and early American history, which is the reign of King James II. Now, right around the time that Van den Bosch was getting in trouble in Boston, in England, the younger brother of King Charles II, the man who had been the Duke of York, the guy after whom New York was named, the man who was the proprietor and governor of New York after the conquest of New York, James Stuart, becomes king, which he should do. He was the younger brother of King Charles. King Charles had no legitimate children. So by all the rules of heredity and monarchy, James was the most legitimate candidate for the throne. But there was one big problem, which is that even though he had been raised Anglican like his brother, at some point, probably in 1616, so after he had become the proprietor of New York, for personal reasons, he has a religious conversion to Roman Catholicism. And of course, Roman Catholicism, there were some Catholics in England, there was a lot of Catholics in Ireland, but the whole Church of England, the Puritans, all the religious change that had been happening for the previous years or so in English history was about getting away from Roman Catholicism. So the Protestants in the country were very worried about what it would mean if the king suddenly became a Catholic, because back in the 16th century during the Reformation era, King Henry VIII had been a Catholic, but then he decided to become a Protestant, and so that changed the religion of the country. But then when his daughter, Queen Mary, became queen, she was a Catholic, and she made the country go back to Roman Catholicism. And a number of Protestants protested and became martyrs because they refused to conform to the Roman Catholic Church. But then she died, and then Queen Elizabeth became queen, and the country went back to Protestantism. So there was a fear. There was a lot had happened in between, but there was a fear that he might try and change the entire religion of the country again and bring it back to Catholicism. So even though he was the legitimate king, people were worried about his religion. Exactly what he planned to do is hard to say, but what he did do is he did promote religious toleration. And because he was the proprietor of New York, he had promoted religious toleration in New York as well. There were not many Catholics in New York, so this is mostly about tolerating the Dutch Reformed and the English Presbyterians and English Quakers and the other different sorts of Protestants then living in New York, but also the small Jewish community in New York. All of those were tolerated by James's governor in New York. So he's a Catholic, but he's also pro-toleration. So that's going on in the background at the time that Van den Bosch comes down to New York. And he comes to New York because there's French-speaking colonists in New York. They have two churches, one that Pierre Daillet had just established up in New Paltz, another on Staten Island, which is where the main community was. There were some who were living in Manhattan, but more were living on Staten Island. And they didn't have none of these churches had a permanent minister. Pierre Daillet is still sort of traveling around. So Van den Bosch gets in touch with the community in New York, and they decide to appoint him their minister on Staten Island. Pierre Daillet does not like him. He tries to stop it, but the congregation decides to hire him, and it looks like a gift from heaven. If you're one of these Walloons, they had not had a minister for years and years. You need a minister, at the very least, you need somebody to help you to baptize your children, to perform legitimate marriages, but also just to help educate you with his preaching. So Van den Bosch is moving around in colonial America where there's a lot of ministers in New England, but in the other areas, there's not enough ministers for the people there. So there's a need and a demand, which helps explain why a guy like him was able to keep on getting jobs, even though it's pretty clear he was not an ideal candidate for these jobs. We don't know very much about what he did on Staten Island, but about a year, but he was only there for about 8 months. And my sense is that he probably got into some trouble. He probably was also not making as much money as he wanted to. But the only evidence I found about what was going on is that a servant girl from Staten Island, a French servant girl, later told people that he had lived, quote, an evil life on Staten Island. Exactly what that was, we don't know, but based on what he did in Kingston, which we do know a lot more about, I think we can get a good idea that he was probably drinking too much and chasing after women, especially servant girls. But the people in Kingston did not know that. So when he finds out that Kingston's minister had died, and the people of Kingston are desperate for a new minister, he applies for the job. And he's fluent in Dutch, and he's an educated minister. He's got some experience, so it seems like he could be an ideal candidate. And so the congregation in Kingston appoints him. And in terms of Ulster County history, he looks like he's perfect. Ulster, it was poor. It had a hard time finding a minister. It had just gotten one, but then he died. It's a mixed community where people speak French, Dutch, and English. Van den Bosch is one of the only people around who's pretty fluent in all three of those languages, so he can communicate with everybody. He's French in origin, but he does get along very well with Dutch people. And from the other evidence, his friends tended to be Dutch people rather than French-speaking people. And so he's accepted by the elite. You have to remember that a minister, after the governor, after the political leaders, he was the most prominent and important and well-paid member of the community, the most socially prestigious person. And so all of the elite in the region get interested in him and start socializing with him. And within a couple of months, he has met and married a young woman named Cornelia, who's the daughter of a man named Dirk Wessels ten Broek of Albany, one of the wealthier and important members of the Dutch community in Albany. And they get married up in the church in Albany. So he's married into the elite of the region. Things seem to be going well. Cornelia, she was about 17, 18 years old at the time. And as far as we can tell, she was a very good, devout Christian woman. So it looked good like a good match to her to marry a minister, and to be a minister's wife was something worth aspiring to. But it turns out that this guy is not an ideal minister by any means. And here's where that evidence that I was talking about, that source material, becomes really interesting. Because he started making jokes to people. Somebody brought a baby in for baptism, and he said, "Oh, you want me to give it some ointment?" Which the person thought was strange, but didn't quite know what to do with it. Sometime later, he jokes to somebody that about confession. Confession is a sacrament in the Roman Catholic Church, not in the Protestant churches. But he told a story about how the ancient Romans used to beat their wives before going to confession, because their wives would then reproach them and complain about all the bad things that their husbands had done to them. So then the husband would know what he needed to confess to the priest the next day. He also told somebody else a story about how Jesuits, some Jesuits didn't get married, but others did get married. They had a wife, but without getting officially married. And the person he told the story to remembered him saying, "Oh my God, that is the kind of marriage I agree with." And he was a drinker. Various references to him being drunk. And at one point, somebody remembers him getting up drunk, slapping his behind in shoes, flipping his thumb, and saying, "The farmers are my slaves," which is a weird thing to do, but I just point that out because he's going to become a populist hero for the farmers of Ulster County, but he's an imperfect hero. He doesn't love them at all, but because of the circumstances, he becomes sort of a leader in the farming for the farming community in Ulster. So for about a year, Cornelia tries to keep the marriage together, but it just starts falling apart because of Van den Bosch's behavior, his drinking. He doesn't get along with her family. He starts thinking that Cornelia is cheating on him. He starts getting into fights with her, starts beating her. He also starts chasing around their servant girl and the friend of the servant girl. Now, this is something that happened, it was not uncommon in Europe and European colonies at this time, that young servant girls, who were often from lower class families, working in higher class families, would be vulnerable to sexual harassment from the men in the households. But we don't always have very much evidence about that unless something actually happened. Here we have some evidence because in the course of the investigation of Van den Bosch, one of the people they interviewed was his servant girl, who told some stories about the weird things that he did to her, or told, or was talking to her. He's not does not seem to have raped her, but he probably would have liked to if he could have. But he does act very strangely, and not only to the women in his household, because while the men in Kingston were out working in the fields, he's roaming around town visiting their wives, and has some odd, funny conversations with him. And this is the part of the document that I think is really fascinating because it shows you see what women are doing in their daily lives. At one point, he walks up on a woman who's baking some bread. At another point, he finds somebody sees him lying on the floor next to a woman who she was sick. She probably had a migraine or something and was lying down on the floor, and he was lying on the floor next to her, whispering in her ear. Nobody knows what he was saying, but it's really strange behavior. But it's not technically illegal. So about a year, the people in Kingston had to deal with this. Their minister, the man who's supposed to be the spiritual and moral leader of the community, behaving in really strange and unusual ways that nobody had ever seen. They didn't know what to do. But eventually things go too far. He gets into a fight with his wife on a Sabbath after he'd celebrated the Lord's Supper, which was the Dutch Reformed Church only did that a few times a year. So it was a very special, supposed to be a holy day, but instead of being filled with spiritual goodness, Van den Bosch, for whatever reason, was full of malice, got into a fight with his wife, which got really bad to the point where he started choking her. And at this point, Cornelia's relatives kick in, and the elite in Kingston and Albany turn against him. The elders in the church suspend him from preaching. He still does some of the functions of a minister, like baptisms and marriages, which are basic community needs that they have, but he's otherwise not allowed to continue his job as a minister. And it's at this point that they start the investigation, where they start interviewing people and producing the evidence, the testimony that forms the document that allows him to tell this incredible story. Now, one of the things that's weird about this story is that he's behaving very badly. And most of the ministers in colonial America, sometimes they had theological differences with each other, but generally they behave pretty well. We don't see the sort of bad misogynist kind of behavior in individuals. And that nothing like this had ever happened in New York before. And nobody knew what to do. There was no mechanism, there was no institution within the church to deal with this, because he hadn't done anything illegal in the sense that it could be punished by a civil court. So it's a problem that the church has to resolve, and it just doesn't have the capacity to do that. So by June of 1689, people in New York are trying to figure out how to deal with this problem, and then history kicks in and makes it all a lot more difficult. History in the sense of William of Orange, who was a prince of the Netherlands, an important political leader. He's also the son-in-law of King James II, and also his cousin. William's grandmother was um, an aunt of James II. They're closely related. William was a devout Protestant, and for that reason was very popular in England. And he had married Mary, James II's oldest daughter, who also was a devout Anglican. And basically, by the summer of 1688, people in England were so worried about what was going to happen under James, um, because he was starting to, it looked like he was not just promoting religious toleration, but maybe he was being a little too much, showing too much favor to Catholics and starting to discriminate against the Anglican Church. And then he had married an Italian Catholic princess. And to cap it all off, that summer, they had a child, a son. So at that point, it looked like England might have a Catholic dynasty that might last for who knows how long. As long as James did not have a son, people thought that maybe, all right, maybe he'll die and soon, and we'll get over this, and one of his daughters will take over. But he wasn't dying, and now he had a son. So a number of aristocrats and leaders in the Church of England basically invited William of Orange to come in and help them out, somehow help them get rid of their king. Now, William of Orange wanted to do this because he wants England to join him in the war that had just started with France. France is expanding into the Netherlands, into what's now Belgium. He's worried France is gonna invade the Dutch Republic and try and conquer it all. So he needs help. And so he raises an army, goes into England, and this is a picture from later on. The basic point of this picture, and this is the reason why the revolution is called the Glorious Revolution, is that the Dutch invaded England, but because the Dutch were Protestants representing the Protestant cause, the English people did not fight back. They welcomed him in. In England, it was a bloodless revolution, and King James flees. And William becomes king, and his wife Mary becomes queen. And now the government is firmly Protestant in England, but overseas, chaos erupts because the whole basis of legitimacy had been called into question, and the people in America had to decide, like, which king were they going to support? The legitimate King James II, who people didn't like because he was Catholic, or the new King William, who was not officially legitimate yet, but he was a Protestant, and was represented the sort of king that people would have preferred to have. So in all the different colonies, there was some sort of a struggle. The most dramatic one was in Boston, where people came out and raised the militia and overthrew and imprisoned the governor, Governor Andros, and as well as the handful of soldiers that he had with him. So basically staged a local version of the Glorious Revolution. And normally this would not have been a big deal in New York, except that under King James, the government of the whole region had been changed in where all the separate colonies, the separate states now of New England, of Massachusetts, Connecticut, had been united into a larger dominion of New England, and New York and New Jersey had been added to that as well. So Andros was New York's governor as well as the governor of Massachusetts. In New York, they had this other guy, Francis Nicholson, who was the lieutenant governor, sort of representing Andros. And suddenly his boss is gotten overthrown in Boston. And he's trying to keep a lid on things down in New York. But he refuses to proclaim King William as King of England, because he hasn't gotten any official orders to do that from England. And because England is in chaos, they haven't sent those orders. People in New York start getting anxious. They think maybe Nicholson's really working with James and the Catholic cause, and he's going to invite the French down from Canada. So the militiamen, led by start gathering outside. Here you can sort of see, this is from a textbook where Nicholson and the wealthy elites in New York are trying to calm down the crowds and say, just wait, be patient. But they get increasingly restless, and eventually, led by Jacob Leisler, who was a wealthy merchant in New York and also a militia captain, a lot of the militiamen in New York decided to basically staged a coup to take over the government, and Jacob Leisler becomes the de facto governor. He's standing up for King William, but he doesn't have any legitimate authority. And that's very important because he represents what many people in New York wanted in terms of their government, but he didn't have any proper legitimate authority. And so there was a lot of people across New York, and especially in upstate New York, in Albany and Kingston, who did not think he was a legitimate ruler. because he'd come to power through this revolution. And so things are starting to get chaotic up in Ulster County. No, there's no riots, nobody's killed, but there's a lot of people are very upset with what's going on, and all of those social divisions and those ethnic divisions that I talked about earlier are starting to come out. The people from Hurley and other places out in the countryside, they're stopping, they're not going to Kingston to church anymore. And the colony starts, you can see it's starting to split into some people, especially in the countryside and places like Hurley, who liked Leisler and supported him. But the elites in Kingston did not. They're what we call anti-Leislerians. And all of this is happening at the same time as the investigation of Laurentius van den Bosch is taking place. And van den Bosch is, Leisler knows about him and doesn't like him because he is not a very good representative of the Reformed Church. But because the people in Kingston hate Leisler, the people in Hurley who like Leisler, because the people in Kingston who are anti-Leisler hate van den Bosch for good reason, the people in Hurley and in the countryside embrace van den Bosch as sort of a bit of a hero. And he becomes a preacher to those communities out in the countryside, those places where they didn't have their own church. Now there's only one minister in the county, and now he's working for them. In the meantime, you can see van den Bosch's persecution complex is only, and his sort of narcissism is getting enhanced by this whole situation. There's this amazing long letter where he complains about what is happening to him, and saying that his enemies, Cornelia's family and relatives and the elite in Kingston and Albany, are dealing with me worse than the Jews with Jesus Christ, accepting that they could not crucify me. So he's out there in Hurley and in the other little hamlets around, preaching. He's baptizing people. He's performing marriages. He's giving them the church that they never had, but that they wanted. And he's giving them sort of religious independence from the church in Kingston. The people in Kingston don't like this. They say that the simple-minded ones out in Hurley are the ones who are supporting van den Bosch and allowing him to get away with all this bad behavior, because nobody can bring him to trial or anything, because he's being protected and sheltered by the people in Hurley and those other communities in the countryside. Meantime, the Dutch Reformed Church in New York can't do anything because as Leisler's government is running things, there's a lot of confusion and chaos. Many of the ministers in the church opposed Leisler, so they had to flee. The one minister from Schenectady who had started the investigation, he gets killed because by embracing King William, the New York had also embraced the war against France, and there's the French colony of New France up in Canada. And that winter, an expedition of French soldiers and Native American allies attacked and destroyed the town of Schenectady and killed the minister. There's riots and fights up and down New York between pro and anti-Leislerians. Leisler, he's trying to raise taxes because he wants to fund an army to go invade New York. That's very expensive. People complain. He sends in militiamen to suppress that. So there's just sort of chaos going on all over New York. And so nothing can be done about van den Bosch in Ulster, not anytime soon. The Glorious Revolution in New York is a pretty chaotic and confusing affair. Nobody's killed or anything in Ulster, and we don't know a whole lot about what was going on. And this is one of the reasons why I think the van den Bosch case is so interesting and important, because that's our one real window into what was happening, and it confirms the fact that there were political divisions and antagonisms in Ulster County, primarily between Kingston and the rest of the county. But all of this starts coming to an end in the spring of 1691, when England finally sent out a governor and a military officer, Colonel Henry Slaughter. Um, uh, so he's now the legitimate governor. Leisler hands over the government to him. But then, because the New Yorkers were so angry with each other, anti-Leislerians get in good with Governor Slaughter, and they persuade him that uh, Jacob Leisler, was a traitor. They get him to sign an execution warrant for him. Leisler and his second in command were executed publicly in New York in a very controversial execution. And then Slaughter actually dies a couple of months later from bad health. So the government in New York is still in confusion for a while. In the meantime, changes are happening in the other colonies because of the Glorious Revolution. Another big important one for this story is in Maryland, which, as many of you probably know, had originally been founded and was led by Catholics. And under King James, that was fine, but obviously with the Glorious Revolution, that became a bit controversial. So Protestants in Maryland staged their own coup and overthrew the government in Maryland. And then in 1692 made the Church of England, for the first time, the official Church of Maryland. So that meant that Maryland needed Anglican ministers, and there's very few Anglican ministers around. But that opens up a job for Van den Bosch, who he was ordained as an Anglican minister. So the next thing we know about him is that he moved down to Maryland sometime after 1692. We don't know, around 1692. We don't know exactly when. And here we're getting to the very end of the story, but there's some interesting tagline to this, because in the course of his experiences in Ulster and Maryland, Van den Bosch had gotten to know some Native Americans, probably some Shawnees, who, because of Native American politics that I've worked on, had actually moved into Ulster County for a while in the 1690s from the west. They lived out west in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. And somehow some of them knew French. Because Van den Bosch knew French, he was able to talk with them about what they had seen in the West. And in 1694, one of the last bits of evidence we have from him is he writes a letter to Francis Nicholson, the same guy who had been the lieutenant governor of New York, who in the meantime had become the governor of Maryland, where Van den Bosch was now, asking him for some patronage and saying he has a lot of important information to share with him. And here's what that information is. I don't know if anybody can recognize what this is. It's a map of American geography. It's actually a map. It's the first known map of the mouth of the Mississippi River. And this is drawn by Van den Bosch based on the information that the French-speaking Native American gave to him. This was right around the time when the French are beginning to establish New Orleans. So this is like really important information for the British. And it's actually remarkably accurate given, the distance and that Van den Bosch had on that information. So this is actually Van den Bosch's real, tangible, big legacy for American history. More locally, though, he became just a bad memory. And by some point in 1696, he died. We don't know exactly when or how, but news had obviously made it back to Ulster County because that July, Cornelia, who had to live as an abandoned wife for several years, married one of the men who had been one of the most vocal opponents of Van den Bosch, the local blacksmith named Johannes Weenkoop. And they had a child and a family, and seemed to live happily ever after. So that is the end of our story about the crazy happenings in Ulster County during the Glorious Revolution, and what we were able to learn thanks to the strange behavior of Laurentius Van den Bosch. So thank you very much for indulging me and listening to my to my story here, and I'll be happy to take any questions or ideas or thoughts about what all of this is and what might be done with it, because I hope to write a book about it someday.
Questions? You can use the chat feature or you can just chime in at this time. That was excellent. Well, I'll start then with a question. Did the during the Glorious Revolution, or during it, did the um, state of or the colony of New York at that point, was it established still as a Anglican, or was it old Dutch Reformed at that time? It was Anglican. What was the
It
official?
remains Dutch. There are efforts later on in the early 18th century to build up an Anglican community in Kingston, but it remains Dutch Reformed. Um, uh, Basically, the sources don't talk about Van den Bosch. Apart from that source I found, there's only a few small mentions of him. But I'm sure that in local memory, people knew what he did, they remembered what he did, and he basically discredited Anglicanism, I think, for at least a generation, if not longer, in Ulster County. So there was efforts to build up an Anglican community, but it was not successful for a couple generations later.
So the Dutch Reformed. It was called the Dutch Reformed at that time.
It was the Dutch Reformed Church. Yeah.
So it stuck around longer than it may have otherwise because of that experience.
It's possible. It's possible. Yeah. I mean, he had been working as a Dutch Reformed minister, but he was very bad at it. And I think the fact that he had also been associated with the Anglican Church, convinced people that purely Dutch Reformed ministers are much better than anybody tainted with Anglicanism.
Mhm. Mhm. Come on, any questions? There was a lot covered. Here's a question. Was the Italian woman the Duchess of Modena, the Duchess of
Yes.
County
Yeah.
named
Yeah.
after?
Yeah. Mary of Modena is her name.
Was she was she a Catholic, I guess? Is that right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Very Catholic.
Um, I wonder if the town Modena in Ulster is named after that too. I don't know. Any other
Uh,
questions? Any other questions?
yeah. Somebody was asking, sorry, um, what can be learned about this? I think, well, it's a crazy story. So it's sometimes there's just like crazy things happen in history and it's hard to, draw a big lesson from that. But one thing I think that is worth knowing, not just about this episode, but this whole period in New York history with this split between Leislerians and anti-Leislerians, is that becomes a big part of New York political culture for a long time, because this was so that shift in governments and the execution of Leisler and the antagonism was there for the next couple generations in local politics and in churches and everywhere. People kind of resented each other, and they tended to either think Leisler was good or Leisler was bad, and those factions, those kind of parties, became the basis of kind of an early party system in New York politics. And that is something you do not see in the other colonies. And in the broader scheme of American history, it's really New York that is the first place that has party politics, that isn't just governed by a bunch of elites where people might have some differences, but they're not divided into distinct groups of people who vote for one party or another. But in New York, that was the case. So New York was really and in theory, everybody thought that would be a terrible idea, because it caused controversy in New York, but it just made elections competitive. And it's really from New York that America got this idea that you can have competing parties and in a democracy, and it won't be the end of the democracy, but that it can work out. And that goes back to this Leislerian division. I think the other thing is, just for local history in Ulster County, you can see how diverse the place was. And you can see that uh, um, uh, it didn't have the kind of social cohesion that you see in New England, for example. Like the diversity of origins and attitudes, there was some difficulty there. Um, uh, okay, just a question. Did Cornelius and Johannes live? I think they stayed in the Kingston area, actually. So there's descendants, you're right, that there's families in Hurley that have that association. Um, uh, um, so they become part of the local community, an important part of the local community in Ulster, but they also have, both of them have connections in Albany. Um, uh,
There's another one right here that's talking about Church
Esopus.
DeWitt,
Thank you.
Church DeWitt. Um, and in your studies or research, did you read about him? And did anyone else have any? Was the records from the trial the only records about Laurentius de Bosch, or were there?
That's the main, yeah, that's the main source. Um, if you look at my article, um, I have a lot more names of the specific individuals who were going after uh, Lawrence van den Bos, um, and that will give you a lot more of the local color. I'm just going to put it in the chat there. That's the title for the article in New York History. So if you have a local library that has a subscription to the journal New York History, you should be able to get access to that. And then the biography I did of Lawrence van den Bos was published in a book, a collection of lives of Dutch clergymen. So yes, if you know the local history and the local names, you'll find it really, really interesting, I think, to see who supported him and who was against him. Um, I'm sorry, I don't have all the notes immediately to hand, but basically all the people who were important in Kingston and who had close connections to Albany were against him, whereas the sort of the smaller people from places like Hurley were his big supporters.
There's a question.
Oh, sorry, somebody asked about the language in the records. It's all in Dutch. There was a transcription made in the mid 20th century by one of these American scholars who knew Dutch and translated some of the old Dutch sources. So you can find that transcription in the New York Historical Society. I think if you go, and that's those are Xerox copies, so they'll let you read that, I think, if you want to read all the details. And it's much easier to read than the original Dutch. But the Dutch documents are still there too.
Someone's asking about the title of the article you mentioned. Could you enter it or re-enter it in the chat? Or a link to and a link
Oh,
to,
I'm sorry. It went to the direct messages too. Sorry.
yeah.
Okay.
One of the things that
Yeah.
you touched upon in the trial was his treatment of women and how it was a window upon the lives of women at that time. Um,
Yeah.
did you have anything further to add to what it revealed that you thought was interesting about the lives of women at that time?
Well, in the testimony, the women talk about where they were and what they were doing. So you get to see the kinds of work that they did. You also get to see who they're with and like, so when Phantom Boss chokes his wife, the servant girls are there, like there's witnesses there. So you get a sense of like um how people, occupied these spaces. Um and then you just get their words, you get their stories where this just telling where they're telling these accounts, and like otherwise you just do not have direct verbal transcriptions of women saying, really anything. Um So and so there's some interesting things about the ways they talk about what happened, and then who they knew and how they heard about what and where they were when they saw what. So it just gives you some picture of like what it was like for them to be living in these communities, and their connections to other peoples, and because he's breaking all kinds of social norms. You also get to see like what their expectations for proper behavior were from the men in the community.
Well, here is an interesting one. Why didn't Cotton Mather have more power over Vanderbosch? I guess he was part of the witch trials.
The Salem witch trial. Yeah, well, Cotton Mather is associated with the Salem witch trials because he wrote a book, and he wrote in support of it, and he spoke in support of the trials. But he did not prosecute the trials himself. The trials were done by a secular court, not by ministers, and it's the secular court that gathered the testimony and did the prosecutions and executed people. Cotton Mather supported it. He wrote letters in support of it and so forth. He gave them the theory to convict people of witchcraft, but he didn't actually do it himself. So he didn't have that kind of governmental power, and that's because the ministers in New England didn't have that kind of power. It was the New England ministers are very important and very influential, but they drew a strict line between the power that a minister could have versus the civil power of government. And ministers were not allowed to have any direct role in government or in the courts.
Another question here. Did your research on this period give you new insights to relations between the colonists and indigenous people? The
Well, I have a separate line of research about the indigenous people in the region. There's no Native Americans appear in the sources about Van den Bosch. Um, no slaves. It's just the people that he was interacting with and were affected by him. But there is that one bit where he does somehow have a relationship with a probably a Shawnee man enough to get that information that he could do the map. And from my other line of research, I know about the relationship between the Esopus, not just in the colonists, but also the Esopus and other Native American groups, including the Shawnee. And so something happened, and that's one of the things with history is you don't always have the evidence showing you everything that was happening. We have all this evidence about how he was behaving with women in the community, but we have very little about how he was relating to Native Americans. But clearly, at some point, while he was out in the countryside, I think he got to know, he developed some connections with Native Americans. And I think that happened before he went to Maryland, and that's where he got the information to draw up the map. Um, so that's the main bit there, but also that time in the 1690s, you had people, Native American people from, what's now Ulster County, going all the way out to the Mississippi River for fur trading already, which is very early to have people going that far west from the East Coast.
One of the comments said that they found some parallels between this period of time and our current era. Do you feel that?
Yeah,
Do you feel that way, or is that, or is that just how do
I
you?
was thinking about that actually a little bit before um, this morning. Uh, I mean, yeah, honestly, Van Bosch is really kind of a Trump-like figure in many ways. Um, and uh, he's mostly in it for himself, and he does not treat women very well, but he's a populist hero because he's challenging the establishment, not because he believes, he really loves and cares for the poor people in Ulster County. And then the whole but he's able to do what he does because the system and the society is divided and in some chaos. And then I was just thinking when talking about the Glorious Revolution, it's like in a small way, the way sums that the way that before Trump was elected, the way people are talking, we don't talk about the Catholic threat anymore, but the way people were talking about the fascist threats um, uh, is a little bit similar to, Trump is legitimately elected. James II was legitimately, by monarchical standards, became the king. Um, uh, uh, so, by the legal standards of the day, they deserve that authority, but a lot of people don't like them. So, the next parallel that I could imagine is like, the whole invasion of England by William of Orange to get rid of the unpopular king. It would kind of be like, if American liberals who really don't like Trump brought in Trudeau from Canada or, Sheinbaum from Mexico to kind of come in and take over to replace the monarch that they can't, the system put in place, but they really don't like, but they cannot get rid of by any normal, legitimate means. Um, and in English history, that was, it was absorbed into the Constitution and the political system. So it doesn't, the English do a lot of work to downplay the fact that, there was this revolution prompted by this foreign invasion, and they try to pretend like they did it all themselves. Um, but they did not. If the Dutch had not invaded, English history would look very different.
Is there when William of Orange took over, being Dutch, was there any benefit to the former Dutch colonies in New York with that happening?
It made the Dutch a bit more acceptable, I think. Yeah, it made them feel a bit more at home in the British Empire. I mean, the immediate effect was chaos, like I was saying, with the Leisler's rebellion and so forth. But over time, it facilitated the incorporation of the Dutch of New York into the British Empire and then the United States. So, because they could, they made an important contribution to British freedom and British liberty. So they could be proud of that. Whereas before then, they had been rivals of the English, mostly economic rivals. They had lost most of the Anglo-Dutch wars. They lost New Netherland. So, yeah, I think so.
Other questions for our Wonderful lecture, presentation has been excellent, Professor. You are a welcome contributor to our community's understanding of this very interesting period of time, which obviously is a part of Hurley's um, fascinating history. Um, let's see. There's some Ostranders here who were one of the early settlers in Hurley. Um, welcome, Sheila. Are there any other questions at this point? I don't want to take up more of your time. You probably haven't even had breakfast yet. Um,
Oh yeah, thank you. Well, thank you all for listening. It's been so nice to be able to talk to people who really know and appreciate this local landscape. And I would just say that people like you won't find this history in the textbooks or the history books about Ulster County. A lot of people did their best to forget it, but I bet if you were teleported back to Ulster County in about 1700, everybody would have been talking about this guy and what he'd been doing. It was a huge, crazy kind of scandal. There's nothing like it. I've studied colonial American history, nothing like it anywhere else in colonial America. So it is a very distinctive piece of history that you may or may not be proud of, but it does sort of set your community apart.
It gives a different viewpoint for the Hudson Valley. There's so much promotion revolution, but this is before that. And I think
Yes.
a lot of it is not, it's not prevalent, should I say.
Yeah, yeah, and it's an interesting, it's an interesting time. It's an interesting place. So yeah, I would like to do more with this history so that people pay more attention to it. But yes, thank you very much for listening to me. It was a real pleasure to go back to my research and pull all this together. Um, and thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you. And if should you find yourself in our neck of the woods again, we would be delighted to have you visit the Hurley Heritage Society. Give us a heads up, and we'd be delighted to give you a personalized tour. And if you had any more information that you would like to share with us, we'd love to hear it. And if with that, I would like to then end the evening by just sharing with everyone, thank you for coming out on this evening. Stay tuned for our upcoming lectures, and information about them will be posted on our website and social media. And be sure to sign up to receive our newsletters by visiting our website, hurleyheritagesociety.org. With that, if there's nothing else from you, Professor, I'm going to end it at this time. And once again, thank you very much on behalf of the Hurley Heritage Society and the community of Hurley for your fascinating and very interesting presentation. And again, we will be posting a recording of this in the coming days, and we'll share that with everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you again.